For decades, one organization in America held a kind of unofficial moral authority in the public square. If their name appeared alongside yours or alongside your organization's name, consequences followed. Donors disappeared. Platforms canceled. Reputations were damaged, sometimes permanently. The Southern Poverty Law Center, based in Montgomery, Alabama, sitting on an endowment that at one point exceeded $500 million, funded by some of the most prominent names in progressive philanthropy. They maintained a list, a hate group list, and if your organization appeared on it, you were effectively marked. Conservative voices, faith communities, Republican-aligned policy groups. The list was the weapon. And the SPLC wielded it with authority. Their promise to donors was simple. Your money builds the wall standing between America and the hate groups that want to destroy her. Then the Department of Justice walked in. And what they found behind that wall was not a civil rights organization. What they found were wire transfers, bank accounts, secret payments to a KKK imperial wizard, to neo-Nazi organizers, to one of the architects of the 2017 Charlottesville rally that tore this nation apart. Over $3 million. Nearly a decade hidden from donors, hidden from the IRS. The wall was not keeping hatred out. The wall was funding it. There is a principle I want you to hold on to as we get into this conversation. When an institution needs the disease in order to survive, it will never be in the business of a cure. That is not a political observation, friends. That is a spiritual one. And we're going to follow that thread today. This is the Marc Little Show. I am Marc Little. I am your host. I'm a pastor. I'm a lawyer. And I'm a political commentator. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Marc Little Show. I am your host. I'm a lawyer. I'm a pastor. I'm a political commentator, and we are discussing today the devil's fundraiser. And before we get into the details, let me tell you where we're going. Because there are 3 lanes running through this story today. And I want you to see all of them and to capture them as I share. The first lane is faith. What does Scripture say about institutions that profit from the very darkness they claim to oppose? This is not a hypothetical. It's the oldest lie in the enemy's playbook. And we're watching it exposed in real time. The second lane is law. A federal indictment carries specific charges: wire fraud, bank fraud, money laundering conspiracy. Those are not political accusations. They're legal ones. And as a lawyer, I want you to understand what they actually mean for a tax-exempt nonprofit. The third lane is politics. The SPLC was not just a fundraising organization. It was the progressive left's most powerful institutional weapon for labeling and silencing conservatives like me. What happens to that weapon now? Friends, those who have been with us through the Four Pillars of Idolatry series, you'll remember what we established there. Racial idolatry, the elevation of race above our identity as image bearers of God, is not a political invention. It's a spiritual condition, an ancient one that requires a host to survive and a narrative to sustain it. The evidence now before a federal grand jury suggests the SPLC was not fighting that condition. They were maintaining it. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go over to Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12. Has always stopped me when I read it. It says there is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. That verse, it's not written to describe obvious evil. Obvious evil does not need a proverb. It needs a warning. This verse is written to describe something that looks righteous, that carries the language of justice, that attracts good and generous people who genuinely believe they're doing something virtuous. The SPLC looked like that for a long time. And here is the spiritual diagnosis underneath the legal one. An institution built on the idol of racial grievance cannot afford racial healing. Healing kills the model. Think about that carefully. If racism in America were actually defeated, if the hate groups the SPLC claimed to fight actually dissolved, what would justify their existence? What would bring in the next $100 million in donations? The answer, nothing. Which means the institution had a structural incentive to keep the wound open and leaking, not to close it, not to heal it, to keep it visible, raw, and documented. Because a healed wound doesn't generate donations. In the Four Pillars series that we did here on this show, we established that the altar of race operates as a spiritual principality, not merely a social phenomenon. It's ancient. It precedes the civil rights movement. It precedes the Confederacy. What the DOJ indictment now suggests is that the SPLC was not an unwitting participant in that principality. They were actively tending the altar, paying the priests, keeping the fire burning. Ephesians 6:12, it says there, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Paul there is not writing poetry. He is writing a field manual. And what it tells us is that the most dangerous instruments of darkness are rarely the ones that announce themselves. They come wrapped in the language of justice, compassion, civil rights, fighting hate. Yeah. When the enemy dresses darkness in those clothes, and gets good people to write the checks. That is a masterwork of deception. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, it says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. That is exactly what's happening right now. And I want you to understand what is being exposed, because it's bigger than one organization. Let me give you the facts. On Tuesday, April 22nd of this year, the Department of Justice charged the Southern Poverty Law Center with wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering, conspiracy. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche and FBI Director Kash Patel, they made the announcement. This was not a press conference about allegations. This was a federal indictment. And that means that a grand jury, not Kash Patel, not Todd Blanche, a grand jury reviewed the evidence. And they found probable cause that crimes were committed. That's a big difference. Now, let me walk you through what the indictment actually alleges, because the details, they do matter. The core charge is this. The SPLC secretly paid more than $3 million over nearly a decade, from 2014 to 2023, to what they internally called field sources. These were informants placed inside violent extremist groups. The payments were hidden from donors entirely. Donors were told their money fought hate. The money paid hate group members to remain in those groups and report back. Now, here is where it gets specific. Among those identified in the indictment, though not named, is an imperial wizard of the United Klans of America. This is the same organization the SPLC itself identified in a 2013 article as responsible for the 1963 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. And that bombing killed 4 young black girls. The SPLC was publicly condemning this group, while privately writing checks to its leadership. One informant was embedded in the online leadership group organizing the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. The event that produced images of tiki torches, you remember, Nazi flags, and the death of a young woman named Heather Heyer. That was paid $270,000 by the SPLC between 2015 and 2023. And per the indictment, that informant posted racist content at the SPLC's direction. The SPLC's informant was helping organize Charlottesville while on their payroll. Let it sink in. A veteran informant from the neo-Nazi National Alliance, get this, received $1 million over the same period. There's money to be made here, y'all. At one point, this individual assisted the SPLC in stealing 25 boxes of documents from the extremist group's headquarters. The stolen documents then became the basis for a story published on the SPLC's own Hate Watch blog. Can't make it up. The SPLC then paid a second informant $6,000 to take the legal fall for their own theft. This is a criminal enterprise here. One former chairman of the National Alliance received $140,000 from the SPLC between 2016 and 2023, while simultaneously being featured as a subject of the SPLC's extremist files, publicly profiled as dangerous, privately on the payroll. Friends, I've been a lawyer for 32 years, and the legal principle that applies here is very straightforward. A 501c3 nonprofit, and I've run many, carries a legal duty of candor to its donors and to the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Charitable contributions can only be used for the purposes donors were told they were funding. The moment you take donor money that was given to fight hate and use it instead to secretly pay hate group leaders, that's not a bookkeeping error. That's wire fraud. The donors were duped. They were the victims of a scheme. At least that's what we believe at this point. America's first legal president, Gene Hamilton, a former DOJ official, said it well. He called this arrangement unprecedented. A tax-exempt nonprofit using charitable donor funds to pay informants inside violent extremist organizations. He likened it to paying an arsonist to help put out a fire. Sit with that image. The arsonist is on the payroll. The fire kept burning. The donations kept coming. And there is one more piece of this that I need you to hear before we take a break. During this same period, according to Freedom of Information Act records obtained by America First Legal, the Biden Justice Department's Civil Rights Division was actively soliciting the SPLC's advice on cases, inviting them to quarterly departmental meetings, granting them exclusive access to federal hate crime databases. The organization, now indicted for secretly funding hate group members, was simultaneously advising the federal government on civil rights enforcement. That is not a footnote. That's a headline. I'll be right back. This is the Marc Little Show. Welcome back. This is the Marc Little Show. We are in an episode called The Devil's Fundraiser. And we're talking about the unraveling of the Southern Poverty Law Center, the legal indictment, the spiritual diagnosis, and what it means for everyone who had their fingerprints on this organization. That last part is where we are going now. The SPLC did not operate in obscurity. It operated in the full light of celebrity endorsement and progressive philanthropy. Names like George Clooney, whose foundation donated $1 million to the SPLC in 2017. These donations gave this organization not just money, but they gave it moral legitimacy. Their association told the broader culture that the SPLC was credible. It said that it was serious and trustworthy. It amplified the fundraising. It silenced the critics. Now, the question on the table is not simply whether these donors were deceived. The harder question is this: did they have a duty to know? In law, and I want to be precise here, willful blindness, George, is not a defense. When you're a sophisticated donor writing 7-figure checks to an organization and you never conduct due diligence, you never examine the financials, never ask where the operational money is actually going, that's not naivete at that level. Not at that level of wealth and influence. It's not naivete. It's a choice. You chose not to know. And willful blindness to fraud does not insulate you from moral responsibility for its consequences. The SPLC CEO, Brian Fair, responded to the indictment by claiming the organization is being politically targeted. Yeah, that's awfully convenient to say, isn't it? He said the Trump administration is weaponizing the Department of Justice. I could have expected that answer. I want to respond to it, though, directly. A federal indictment is not a press release. Wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering conspiracy are not political opinions. They're specific charges supported by a grand jury's findings of probable cause. The indictment describes conduct with dates. We call that receipts, dollar amounts, and named categories of recipients. That is not the product of political motivation. That is the product of evidence. Claiming political persecution is not a legal defense either, Mr. Fair. It is a deflection. And the courts, not cable news, will sort that out. Proverbs 14:12. I'll say it again. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. The donor class that funded this organization funded that way. Some may have been genuinely deceived. Others had every reason to ask questions and chose comfort over curiosity. Either way, the reckoning is now public. And that matters. Because on Saturday, April 25th, there was another reported attempt on the life of President Trump. The White House Correspondents' Dinner. Details, of course, are still emerging as we record this. And I'm not going to get ahead of what the facts establish. But I am going to ask a question. I'm going to ask a question that I think every responsible American, regardless of party, ought to be sitting with right now. What does a decade of manufactured and funded racial hatred produce We have covered the culture of political violence on this show before. In our episode on Charlie Kirk, we talked about how dehumanizing language, when it comes from institutions with credibility and platforms with reach, creates a moral permission structure for violence. You tell people long enough that their political opponents are Nazis, fascists, and existential threats to democracy, and you eventually find someone who takes that seriously enough to act on it. The SPLC was not a fringe operation. They were a respected institution. They advised the federal government, for Pete's sakes. They shaped the language that major media used to describe conservative organizations and people just like me. Their hate group designations were even cited in academic papers, court filings, and news articles for decades. If the indictment's allegations are true, if they were secretly funding the very actors they were publicly condemning, then the hatred they documented was in part hatred they were paying to exist. So the question I'm asking is not, did the SPLC cause this latest incident at the White House Correspondents' Dinner? I don't know that. Neither does anyone else yet. The question is, who benefits when Americans hate each other? Because whoever benefits, the SPLC was apparently willing to take their money and call it civil rights work. That question deserves an answer. And I believe the American people, the Congress, and the courts are now positioned to pursue one. So where does this go from here? I think it goes in three directions simultaneously. Legally, the indictment must be allowed to proceed on its merits. That means no political interference from any direction. The law applies to the left the same way it applies to the right. If the evidence supports conviction, let justice be done. If the evidence is found wanting, let due process establish that. But the politicalization of this process from either side would be a disservice to the American people. So let's let it ride. Now, politically, Congress has a responsibility to examine the full scope of what the FOIA records already suggest. The SPLC's relationship with the Biden Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, the access they were granted, the cases they influenced. If a privately funded organization with a secret informant program was simultaneously shaping federal civil rights enforcement, that's a serious question about the integrity of that enforcement during that period, now spiritually. This is the one that matters most to me. The church has to stop outsourcing its moral authority to secular institutions. Friends, the SPLC flourished in part because the church went quiet. When we abandoned the public square, when we stopped speaking with biblical authority about justice and truth, and the dignity of every human being made in the image of God. Something always fills the vacuum. We don't have to live in that vacuum. We do not have to live in that vacuum. John 1 verse 5, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That's not a sentiment. It's not a feeling. It's a promise. And it holds even here, even now, even in the exposure of something this dark. The light always wins, but it has to show up. The light has to show up. This has been the Marc Little Show. I am Marc Little. I've been your host. Until next time, please stay in the light. Amen.